Welcome to The Lonely Star. Today's topic is one of those things that just kind of quietly hums along in the background of the world, but when you stop and think about it, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah,
International law.
it really is.
So we're not going to get all textbooky here. We're going to do a deep dive into how this whole idea of countries agreeing on anything even got started.
All right, let's do it.
So our research takes us way, way back, like thousands of years. Think ancient Mesopotamia, 3100 BCE.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. City-states, Lagash and Umma, they hammered out a peace treaty.
A peace treaty that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about like a casual handshake deal here. This was a documented official agreement.
That's incredible. What were they even arguing about back then?
Right. I mean, what was life like that made them think, we got to write this down, this has got to be official?
Well, you got to figure it was probably pretty fundamental stuff. Resources, boundaries, maybe even trade routes. Those are the kinds of things that can lead to friction.
Yeah.
But the point is, they understood, even back then, that having some kind of shared understanding, rules of the game, if you will, was key to keeping things stable.
It's like they had this like primal instinct to avoid just constant fighting.
Exactly. Recognizing shared interests, even if it's just to avoid chaos.
Okay, so then fast forward a bit to 1279 BCE. We've got the Egyptians and the Hittites, Pharaoh Ramses II and King Atuli III.
Big names, big empires.
Big treaty, too. It was all about borders and defensive alliances.
Sounds familiar, huh? Still front page news today.
Right. So what do you think? What was the pressure on these guys to make this thing stick? What were their must-haves?
I mean, their kingdoms were at stake. Literally.
Yeah.
Clear boundaries would help prevent all those misunderstandings.
Border skirmishes?
Exactly. And a defensive alliance. Well, that suggests they saw a common enemy out there somewhere.
Okay, that makes sense.
But think about it. They went to the trouble of chiseling this agreement into stone. They must have really wanted it to last.
Or at least they wanted people to think they did.
Right. Did they actually believe it would prevent future conflict? I mean...
It's a good question. What kind of trust did they actually have?
Right.
Okay, so let's jump ahead to ancient Greece. They developed these interstate rules, especially for peace treaties.
Okay.
But, and here's the thing, our research shows these rules weren't universal. They were mostly for, like, the cool kids table, the Greek city-states.
Ah, the in-crowd.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So who was drawing that line? Who decided who was in the club, who got to play by these rules, and who was left out in the cold?
It's like even in the early days of international whatchamacallit order, it wasn't exactly an open-door policy.
Yeah, so what was the criteria?
Probably a lot of it was about shared culture, language, maybe even this sense of being part of the same heritage.
Okay.
But power dynamics, those definitely would have played a role too. Who had the muscle, who had the influence.
So it makes you wonder, even as we're talking about these, noble origins of international law, was the system kind of rigged from the start?
It's a really interesting question and maybe a little bit uncomfortable. What about the people outside this little civilized circle?
Yeah. Okay, so then we get to the Roman Empire and their idea of just gentium, the law of nations.
Right.
But this was a whole different ballgame. It wasn't really about how states were supposed to deal with each other, more like a legal framework for how to handle foreigners within Rome.
Oh, okay.
So think of it this way. If you were like a traveling merchant in Roman territory, gentium was the law that applied to you.
So it was more about individual people moving around within this big empire.
Exactly. Not so much about separate political units interacting.
Interesting. Why do you think they focused on individuals instead of, state-to-state stuff?
Well, the Roman Empire was kind of a big deal.
Just a little bit.
Right. They were the dominant power. So their main legal headache was how to manage all these different people within their sphere of influence.
Okay.
Gentium gave them a flexible way to handle legal issues involving non-citizens.
So they didn't have to try to apply Roman law to everybody.
Exactly. It was a practical approach for a giant multi-ethnic empire. But, it does make you think about power. When one entity basically dictates the law, is it really international?
That's a good point.
Now, here's another interesting tidbit. Cicero saw just gentium as this universal moral obligation. So their law of nations actually had an ethical dimension. It was all about individuals. When did things change? When did the state become the main player in international law?
Well, most folks point to the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century as a big turning point.
Yeah, okay.
You see, this whole series of treaties established the principle of state sovereignty, the idea that each state has, like, total authority within its own borders and doesn't have to answer to anybody else.
Got it.
That shifted everything. Suddenly, it was all about how these sovereign states interacted with each other. That's what became the heart of international law as we know it today.
So it went from ancient city-state agreements to rules within an empire to a system based on these independent nations. International law has had quite a journey.
It really has. It's fascinating to see how the idea itself has changed so much over time. And when you think about that early focus on individuals with Jeff Gentium and then how it shifted to this state-centric model, what does that say about the purpose of international law in those different eras?
It really makes you think, did one model work better than the other? Was one more fair?
It's a good question.
I mean, that early emphasis on a universal moral obligation towards individuals, that feels pretty different from a system where it's mostly about, state interests and power.
Yeah.
Have we kind of lost something along the way?
Maybe. That tension between individual rights and state sovereignty, that's still a hot topic today.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about things like international criminal law or the responsibility to protect people, even within their own countries. That could be seen as a kind of return to that earlier concern for individuals, but within this state-centric system.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's that whole issue of who gets to be part of the club, that exclusivity thing we saw in ancient Greece. That hasn't gone away either, has it?
Nope, not at all. We still see debates about which countries are recognized as legitimate states, who gets to have a voice on the global stage.
Yeah.
Power, politics, economics, all those things still influence who gets a seat at the table. Makes you wonder what international even means.
So we've gone from carved-in-stone treaties to, the UN and all that. But some things haven't changed. It's still tricky getting countries to cooperate.
Absolutely. That whole dance between wanting rules and looking out for your own interests, that's as old as civilization itself.
Well, this has been a pretty amazing look into the history of international law, and it's definitely given me some things to think about. What about you? What questions are still bugging you after all this?
What really stands out to me is this constant tug of war between, on the one hand, this ideal of having universal rules, and on the other hand, the reality that individual states have their own agendas and power dynamics. How do you even reconcile those two things?
It's like a constant balancing act, right?
Right. International law, at its core, is this ongoing negotiation. It's proof that humanity keeps trying to find a way to get along, even with all our different and sometimes conflicting interests.
Well, that's a hopeful thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the origins of international law.
My pleasure. It's been a fascinating journey.
Goodbye for now, and we invite you to our next podcast, where we will continue to explore the hidden depths of knowledge. Remember, the truth is stranger than fiction.